Have you ever wondered why it is that Rosh Chodesh does not always coincide with a moilad, with a new moon? Because surely the whole point, as in this week's parasha, is HaChodesh Hazeh, right? That months are calculated according to the moon. So how could it be that it's Rosh Chodesh but it's not a new moon? In order to understand that, we're going to explore the whole nature and complexity of the concept of the Jewish calendar, which is not purely just an astronomical calculation, but it's actually the harmonizing of the spiritual and the physical realities, as we'll see from the doyen of the laws of Kiddush HaChodesh, the Rambam himself. In Onfang Hilchis Kiddush HaChodesh, the beginning of the halachas of Kiddush HaChodesh, Zog the Rambam gives us the following overview of how it all works. He tells us that Chodshei HaShana Eim Chodshei HaLevana, that on our calendar the months are lunar months, and he bases it on two psukim, Shenemar, because it tells us Eilas Chodesh B'Chodshei, that you have to bring the Rosh Chodesh sacrifice once a month. V'Nemar, and of course in our parasha, HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem Rosh Chodoshim, that month where Hashem shows Moshe Rabbeinu the new moon, he says that's how you'll know, Kazera Evach Kadesh, that's what you got to see and sanctify. That is the beginning of the series of months. So it's clear that our months are lunar. Then says the Rambam, V'Hashonim Shonu Mechashvin, the years that we calculate, Heim Shnei Achama, are solar years. How do we know that? Key piece of information for our conversation over here, Shenemar, because the pasuk says, Shomoir es Chodesh Ha'aviv. When it comes to Pesach, you have to ensure that Pesach is in the season of spring. So let's understand what that means. Der Pirush davon. Chodesh HaLevana besteht von der 29 mit der Halbtage. If you're going to talk around numbers, a lunar month is about 29 and a half days. So feel der Sivuv von der Levana. That's the approximate cycle of one sivuv, one circumference of the moon, one orbit of the moon. Shnas HaChama, whereas the solar year, besteht lerch von 300 mit 65 und a Viertel Tag. A solar year is 365 and give or take a quarter of a day. Das ist man von dem Sibur Shnasi von der Sonne, and that is again the orbit of the sun and moon, the sun and earth relative to each other. The Rambam in der Halacha Anal sagt zwei Dinim. Now here's where it starts to get a little bit sticky, because the Rambam tells us that there are two halachas that we have to consider. Number one, Aleph. As the Chodshei HaShana darfen gerechnet werden Leuten Sibur Balevana. The Rambam tells us that when it comes to calculating months are lunar based on the orbit of the moon. That's clear, we know that. Das heißt, as a Chodesh is nicht a Zwölftel von Shnas HaChama. In other words, we do not calculate 1 month as 1/12 of a solar year. Wie es rechnen die Reuv ha'Uma ist was zu tellen dem Jahr von Malach HaChama auf 12 Chalokim Chadoshim, unlike the rest of the world, which basically takes a solar year and splits it up into 12 equal pieces. We don't do that. Nor Chodshei HaLevana. Our months are measured on a separate system that follows the movement of the moon. So that's the first thing we have to know. How do you know when a month is? You follow the lunar cycle. Then the Rambam tells us something else, which is, Afal Bichein, despite the fact that we follow a lunar cycle, we're not like the Muslims who follow only a lunar cycle. Rather, Vibaldas Pesach Muzaim Bizman Ha'aviv, because there's a separate requirement in the Torah that Pesach has to coincide with spring. And the seasons are determined according to the sun's movement and passage. Now you're going to have a disparity, right? Because how will you get to Pesach based on lunar months? But Pesach has to match the correct season of spring, which is based on the solar year, which is approximately 11 days longer than the lunar year. The lunar year is going to lag behind. So in order to bring it back up to speed, we also calculate the year as a solar year. Und therefore, now that you've got a solar year and lunar months that are supposed to comprise that solar year, you're going to have no choice but to make a leap year. Und therefore is jeder 2-3 Jahr macht besser ein Überjahr kedei sheyeh Pesach bizman ha'aviv. Every 2-3 years we have a leap year to bring Pesach back to where it belongs, so it doesn't fall into the winter, that it should actually be in the spring. Okay, so I think we all know that and understand that about how the calendar works. Where it gets really sticky and tricky is understanding the nature of the solar year and the requirement that Pesach should be in Chodesh Ha'aviv, or Zman Ha'aviv. And that's based on things the Rambam is going to say elsewhere later on in Hilchas Kiddush HaChodesh. The Rambam is mamshech in Devaita Dike Prakim, so later on in Kiddush HaChodesh, all the way down in the 10th parak, The Rambam says nowadays we no longer use Kiddush HaChodesh. We don't wait for witnesses to go to Yerushalayim and testify that they saw the new moon. We have a calendar that you can even download. So that calendar was determined by the second Hillel, and that calendar is ausgestellt in Azar Oifen, is defined in a particular way. As jeder Machzor, that every cycle of that calendar, which is 19 years, gleichen sich ausleglich die Shneis Halavona mit die Shneis Hachama. The lunar and solar years pretty much coincide. Bees to the point as lo yisharim minyan yemei Hachama b'chol 19 shana chutz misha achas v'haba mi'os 85 chalokim. So Rambam tells us the disparity in a 19-year cycle between the solar and the lunar year is going to amount to nothing. Basically like an hour and a half, just less. 1 hour and 485 chalokim. So a full hour is 1,080 chalokim. So this is just less than half. Okay, so there we have it. The Rambam says you'll get this tiny disparity that happens. Frektiv dem de Pirush. So there's a commentary that appears in certain sections on the Rambam called the Pirush. There's different versions of who exactly wrote it. So he says, 1 second, as achar shonim rabois. Fast forward many, many millennia. So you've got this little bit of extra solar year every single year. Multiply that out by thousands. Then you're going to find that the season of spring is actually going to be in Iyar, not in Nisan. Right? Because basically what's going to happen is you're pushing out the solar year, pushing. You're going to have the opposite problem of what we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve for a Pesach that falls back into winter, and we're going to actually land up with a year, or somewhere down the line, with a season of spring, or more correctly, the equinox of spring, that's going to be past the month of Nisan. And he leaves that as a question and says, basically, Eliyahu is going to answer, Mashiach is going to answer, somebody's going to answer. Now the Rebbe says immediately, it's actually not a practical question to date. Bis zum letzten Jahr von Shishler Vishnin da Alme wird die Tkufa fallen noch als B'chodesh Nisan. If you had to extrapolate all the way to the end of 6,000 years that the world is designed to last for, don't worry, we're actually not going to run into this problem practically. That doesn't mean we don't have to discuss it, but it's not going to have a practical impact. So now this is where the real question arises. The din von Shomeres Chedesh HaAviv, the halacha that says that you have to guard the season of spring or the month of spring, is nit nor as Nisan darf sein bisman ha'aviv. That's not the Torah telling us that the month of Nisan always has to be once you've already passed once you're already at the point of spring. Nor as Pesach soll sein bisman ha'aviv. But we need the holiday of Pesach, because it's not good enough if Chavtes or Lamed Nisan is, still Chapzara in the spring. We need Pesach to be at the time of the beginning of spring. With the Rambam Paskin Kenal, as Pshas Besen hat ausgerechnet, as Kufas Nisan wird ausfallen b'Shishas Nisan, fleckt man ma'aber sein dem York Deshia Pesach bisman he'aviv. So that's one of the calculations the Basin would make in the days when they waited for witnesses to come. If they anticipated that it was likely that the equinox, the spring equinox, would fall on the 16th of Nisan, that's too close for comfort. They'd add an Iber Yor so that it would be comfortably into the spring by the time it is Pesach. So now, isn't it moving? If that's the case, we have a big question. Mitzad der Filmolke Sammlung von Sheres HaMachzor Asham mitof be'er halokim besitzt. Now, if you calculate how many years it's been that we've been calculating the astronomy of the world, basically since creation, and each time there's this lag of 1 hour and 485 chalokim, and in fact, not only in our days, but even in the Rambam's days, and possibly even before the Rambam's days, there have been many times in history, in fact it's even recorded in certain Sfarim, many times in history where the spring equinox has occurred after Tesvav Nisan. In other words, Pesach occurred when it's still technically in the winter quarter of the year. So now is wie stimmt es mit dem Din von Shomeres Chedesh HaAviv was Pesach darf sein bisman ha'aviv? Whoa, hang on a second, doesn't the Torah tell us clearly that Pesach has to be in the spring? Now we know, we have evidence, we have records of how in the system there are certain years where it is quite likely, if not definite, that Pesach will happen before the spring equinox. How do you address that? It's a big question about our entire astronomical basis for the calendar. Okay, so let's try and answer. Let's look at something else that the Rambam says later on. As the Iber bleibt von Hashem mit Tov bei Chalokim noch jeden Machzer. Now, how do you get to this calculation that there's an extra 1 hour, 485 Chalokim in every solar year? It depends on whose calculation of how to determine the seasons you use. It's actually a debate in the Gemara between Shmuel and Rav Ada. So, this issue that you're going to have the extra hour and 485 Chalokim every solar year, that is according to one approach. It's what the Gemara calls the calculation of the seasons according to Shmuel, which is a calculation based on this. That's based on a calculation that the length of a solar year is 365 and 1/4 days. Now, if you do the maths, 365 and 1/4 days means that when you catch up in 19 years, you've caught up everything but an hour and 485 Chalokim. So that's where you'll have these extras that keep compounding over the course of time. And by now, we should run into problems, as we see that we do. But if you go with the other view, which is how to calculate the solar year and its seasons according to Rav Ada, he says almost, it's not the opposite, but it sounds opposite. So he says that the full scale of a year, a solar year, is less than 365 and 1/4. So it's 365 and something, 365 days and change, but it's not as much as 1/4 of a day. And if you follow that, then after every 19 years, it will be a beautiful match between the solar and the lunar years, and there'll be no lag. So let's just say the Rambam goes with Rav Ada. That would be easy. Then it's fine, we've got our calendar system, and it complies with the need to have Pesach in the spring, because we can accept as in the Rambam's own words, Rav Ada's calculations are the more accurate calculations, and that must be what we follow. That's how we apply it to our calendar, and so we don't have to worry about all these extra hours that build up over the course of time because they're actually not there. Many of the Rishonim say the same thing, that we follow Rav Ada's opinion. And if that's the case, Pesach will always coincide with the spring. Phew, okay, we have addressed the issue. It is Shmuel who felt that if you calculate the solar year in a particular way, there'll always be this extra hour and a bit, which over time is going to run into a problem for us, and Pesach will be at the wrong time of the year. We don't follow Shmuel. We follow Rav Ada's opinion. The solar year is a little bit shorter, and so it matches beautifully with the lunar year as needed. Sounds like a good solution, right? But there's still something that doesn't seem to make sense. Why do we need the solar and lunar calendars to harmonize? It's because we need Pesach to be in the spring. Now, if you go with Shmuel's view, where there's always a little bit of extra solar year every 19 years, why then does the Rambam say in Perek Vav of Kiddush HaChodesh, why in the first place did we create a 19-year calendar? So he explains, because you'll have 12 regular years and 7 Iber Yoren in that, 7 leap years in that period. And then he says, "V'bald as lo yishaer miminyan yemei hachama chutz mishachas v'chulei." The Rambam says clearly, because this calculation will leave us with no more than an hour and a bit extra every 19 years. So wie es scheich zu semach sein auf dem Minyan, v'bald as die Stavas is nicht in ganzem Essen mit dem Dim von Shomer Chodesh Aviv. So now, how can we have a 19-year cycle if the whole chap of the 19-year cycle, it would appear from the Rambam, is that we're okay with a little bit of extra time? How could you say that? We're not okay with the extra time. The extra time, according to Shmuel's approach, would leave us with a Pesach that's not necessarily always in the spring, and that's a problem. So the first layer of understanding how to reconcile this is we need to distinguish over here between how you calculate the entire cycle of 19 years versus how you calculate Pesach falling in the correct season. They are not mutually reliant on each other. From the Sheina Rambam, when the Rambam uses that expression, when he says we calculate solar years based on the principle Shomer Chedesh Aviv, is moving, that immediately tells us as the limud from Shomer Chedesh Aviv that the Rambam is seeing in those words, care, make sure that you keep the season of spring, is nit nor as Pesach darf sein bisman ha'aviv. That pasuk is not only simply telling us always ensure that Pesach falls in spring, nor euch, as allemal darf auskommen Pesach ungefähr in demselben Zman von Shnas HaChama. The Torah is telling us something way more than that. Not only must Pesach always be in the spring, we want Pesach to be approximately at the same time of year, consistently year in and year out. Spring is a pretty broad concept, right? Spring could spread over 3 months. We want Pesach to pretty much be consistent year on year. That's what it's telling us. So if I'm looking at Shomer Chedesh Aviv in terms of how I know when Pesach is supposed to fall out, the Torah has given me a responsibility to ensure that Pesach is always at pretty much the same time. But when I look at Shomer Chedesh Aviv, like the Rambam says, as the basis for the principle of calculating years based on the solar cycle, then is Genug Shechodesh Nisan Bismanei Aviv. Then that implies that actually it's not that Pesach has to always be at the same time, as long as this month of Nisan is always a month of spring. As a Chedesh Nisan soll in sich haben dem Zmanei Aviv, that contained within Nisan has to be some element of spring, possibly even one day. Over Mele is man dem din genug as the Tkufas Aviv soll sein bechedesh Nisan afil wenn sie is besefer Chodesh. So it all depends which perspective I'm looking from. If I'm looking at the laws of Pesach, Pesach has to always be at that time of the year in the spring. If I'm looking from the law of how a solar year is supposed to be determined according to the Jewish calendar, the solar year has to be consistent enough with the lunar year that at least part of Nisan is in the spring. Two different cheshbonos. Which means, even if I go with Shmuel's approach, now the Rambam says the more correct way is Rav Ada's approach, but even if we went with Shmuel's approach, which says that there's always going to be a little bit of extra solar year at the end of every cycle, as in jeder Machse bleibt a kleiner She'eris, ist durch ein Ausstellen von Schneisa Machse beworren geworden, der Din von Shomer Chedesh Aviv benegea zu Shona al Kol Ponim. At least Shmuel can defend himself and say, well, that requirement that the Torah had, which is that at least a little bit of Nisan had to be in spring, even with my calculations, that would still work. Because one thing we're assured is that the beginning of the summer equinox, the spring equinox, the beginning of Tkufas Aviv will never be later than Nisan. Okay, so it's maybe a little bit tricky for us to understand what's going on over here, but suffice it to say this. If I'm focused on making sure that Pesach always amounts to the same time of the year, I will need to use Tekufas Rav Ada, because otherwise it's going to run late. If all I need to know is that there's a requirement to keep the year solar aligned with the months lunar, and that requires me that at least that month called Nisan has to be part of Tekufas Aviv, or part of Zmano Aviv, that will work even with Shmuel's opinion. Und okay, so looks like we've solved it, right? Und ist echt verständig, was der Rambam sagt, der Tam, was macht noch Minyan Zeh, Minyan von Shneisa Machzor. Now we can actually even understand and appreciate why the Rambam says we'll rely on this 19-year cycle process, where he says, as long as there's not more than an hour and a bit extra at the end of every solar year, it's fine. Why is it fine? Because even if you go with that view, and even if you go with Shmuel's opinion of how you calculate the Tekufos, which is the underpinning of the 19-year cycle, at least one thing you know, you will never start the spring equinox later than somewhere in the month of Nisan, even if it's the last day of Nisan. Und in dem is euch der Cheshbon as leishar chutz mishachas atat maspik if semachna min zekenal. And so yes, there's going to be a little bit of an hour extra every 19 years, but it's okay. It's enough for us to build a cycle that is a tenable, sustainable cycle of bringing the solar and lunar years together. Sounds good, right? No, we have to understand that, hang on a second, something really doesn't make sense over here. Pesach muss man fort ankommen zum Emerson Cheshbon von Tkufas Rav Ada. You cannot get away from the fact that we need Pesach to be in the spring. Yes, of course, it's fine to say that Nisan will be part of the spring, but the Torah wants us to have Pesach in the spring, and the only way to get there is to use Rav Ada's calculations. Which will not leave us with this uncomfortable extra amount of time at the end of every 19 years. So if we have to, at the end of the day, go back to Rav Ada's calculations for practical reasons based on the Torah's requirement that Pesach has to be in the spring, tatsächlich, was darf der Rambam sagen, als man in Gedeminium von Shona ist das gehalten, ich leite Cheshbon von Tkufas Shmuel. Was ist nicht gefi ha-emes? Why does the Rambam have to even discuss this, even suggest that we could fit Shmuel into the requirement that at least the seasons match up to the months? That's great and it's beautiful, but it's not what we need. We need Pesach to be in the spring, not just simply that Nisan is the correct month for Tkufas Aviv. So is Nekudas Habir in them. The explanation is this. Von dem Guf, it's a fascinating concept, when you have two opinions in Torah. So of course we'll always say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. They both are valid. Perhaps one is valid in practice and one is valid in theory. Here the Rambam's telling us something else. The Rambam needs us to know that with regards to the calculations for Pesach, we have to follow Rav Ada's calculations. But we're about to discover that Shmuel's calculations are not only acceptable as an opinion in Torah, but they are relevant to halacha in Torah as well. Von dem Gufa, was der Rambam bringt euch Tkufa Shmuel in Hilches Kiddush HaChodesh, by virtue of the fact that the Rambam quotes Shmuel's calculations in the laws, not a philosophical discussion or Gemara, it's halacha psuka, practical halacha. In the laws of Kiddush HaChodesh, is muchach that itself should prove to us as the tkufa is nit nor adeya and teresemes. That shows us that Shmuel's approach is not just an acceptable, valid opinion within Torah, but more than that, nor eichaz is gehalten in psak halacha. It is something which is relevant to practical halacha. Shmuel's opinion will be relevant to practical halacha. Because halacha is a name from emes lamitoi. Torah is emes, it's absolute truth. And halacha is the most emes of all the emes, because this is how it has to be applied in practical terms. And you see the Rambam himself actually alludes to this concept that there's kind of relative truth to these opinions, because the Rambam is merames mitten lashon. Remember the expression that the Rambam used. Shecheshbon zeh, that to use Rav Ada's cheshbon, hu ha-emes yoiser min harishon, is a more true approach than Shmuel's opinion. He doesn't say it is the true approach. And that's implying that Shmuel is emes, and even emes lamitoi. It has practical application in halacha, just not in the specific context of the Pesach story. Der Cheshbon Arishon Tekufa Shmuel is emes. The Rambam wants us to know that even the original calculations of Shmuel, which give us all kinds of issues with aligning Pesach and spring, it's also a true approach. It's just that Rav Ada's calculation is a truer approach, meaning to say that it accommodates more areas of halacha. So we're going to examine that there are a few different parts of halacha that actually dafka rely on Shmuel's calculations, not on Rav Ada's calculations. Araya of them. So let's prove that Shmuel's calculations are relevant to actually deciding practical halacha. Kama Loches, was seinem verbunden mit Kufas Achama, rechnet man sich nur mit Kufas Shmuel. There are a whole lot of areas of halacha that have to do with the seasons and the solar cycle, where we dafka arrive at the halachic bottom line, dafka based on Shmuel, not Rav Ada's calculations. Ledugma, here's one example. This is the example we're going to mostly pay attention to. Die Brache, was macht, wenn man sagt, ich habe einen Tag von Tkufas Nissen bei Monat von jedem Machzer Godel, 28 Jahre, wenn die Tkufa ist B'tchilas Leil Revi. As we know, every 28 years there's a special bracha that we say over the sun reaching its original point of original orbit at the time of creation. Happens every 28 years. How do we work out when it is? That it's always got to be on a Tuesday evening or going into Wednesday. Was done is the Tkufa Leiten Cheshma von Shmuel and Leiten Cheshma von Tkufa Shavada. Look into it and you discover that the way we calculate when to make Birkas Hachama every 28 years is specifically based on Shmuel's calculations and not Rav Ada's calculations. So the Rambam alluded to that by quoting Shmuel's opinion and including it in the halachas of Kiddush HaChodesh. He was effectively endorsing that Shmuel's calculations are valid for areas of halacha to do with astronomy outside of working out how Pesach is going to be in the spring. Other examples, which we're not necessarily going to focus on, is how we know when you're supposed to start saying the same Talum Matar. Like the Shulchan Aruch brings, that you shouldn't drink water, probably exposed water, it would seem, at the time of the equinox. There again, we only use Shmuel's calculations in order to arrive at those times. So now we've got to understand, how does that actually work? You're talking about calculations. One of the things about astronomy is that it's science. It's not open to opinion. So how could it be that we have two different opinions that are going to bear out in practical halacha, and they're going to reflect on different times, which effectively means some of those times we're going to do things as people that don't necessarily really work with the astronomical calculations that are meant to define those times, especially the one that's quite close to our hearts, which we'll use as the one to explain how this whole strange scenario plays out, that something is practical in scientific terms, and yet the way we address it in Judaism doesn't seem to match the science. We'll explain that through another issue which many of us have raised eyebrows about. It's the one that I'm sure you've thought about before, and that is Rosh Chodesh arbitrarily decided by humans? What does it say? The Gemara Rosh Hashanah. What does it say? Bes and Shekichos HaChodesh. It's actually, the Rambam brings it too. What happens if the Beis Din sanctifies the new month? Bein Shogigin. And they got it wrong. They were mistaken. They misunderstood what the testimony of the witnesses was, or they miscalculated. Bein Mutin, or they were perhaps waylaid. They were misled. Bein Anusim, perhaps they were put under some unusual pressure and they had to determine Rosh Chodesh even though it was incorrect. And like that Zweite Girsa Mezidin, in one opinion even says if they dafka calculated or decided the wrong day for Rosh Chodesh, Harei ze mekudosh. Once they have defined and sanctified Rosh Chodesh, it is binding, even if it's incorrect. And based on that, we've got to determine the dates of the upcoming Yomim Tovim based on their incorrect calculation, regardless of the motivation for why they got it wrong. Now, how could that be? The Teichen from Rosh Chodesh is verbunden mit Chiddush Moed HaLevana. The whole chap of Rosh Chodesh, HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem, is what? New moon. That's what Rosh Chodesh is. The renewal of the moon. Wir Shayech Hazeh Tognen welches is nicht given the Moed. So wenn Rosh Chodesh mit Zadeh was Besen haben mit Kaddish given. So how could it be that a day, which is not the day of the rebirth of the moon, should suddenly now become Rosh Chodesh because the Beis Din decided so? And that's something which is relevant to us today. You look at the calendar and you say, I don't get it. Rosh Chodesh is on this day and the Moed is on that day. How is that possible? Now the Rambam is masbid im tam from the Psak Halacha. The Rambam offers the following explanation as that we have to obviously determine Yom Tov to be on the days based on the calendar that the Beis Din decided. Why? Because the same God who told us that we have to keep these holy days is the same God who told us, and we have to rely on the Beis Din to work out when they are. But that doesn't really answer the question, does it, right? That tells us about Yom Tov, which makes sense. But das ist lechera nor atam maspik favos mizmuchiv zu verlassen sich auf den Kiddush HaChodesh from Beis Din. That explains to us why you should trust or rely on the Beis Din about Yom Tov. So bleibt aber nicht moving the etzem inen, but the real core issue remains a question. V'hazoi v'der tog roish chodesh. The Moiled is an under tog. How practically can this date be Rosh Chodesh if it is not the time of the new moon? It is a fundamental question. Practically, scientifically, astronomically, there's no new moon today. Why is it Rosh Chodesh? Or the new moon was yesterday. Why is today Rosh Chodesh? So the explanation is this: that we are Jewish people. We don't live purely in the physical or the scientific world. We live in an harmonious reality that blends the spiritual and the physical. And whatever plays out down here in the physical reality is just a reflection of how things are in the spiritual truth. Chamo levana uninyonem dolamato. So the sun, the moon, and all the other things that are their accessories here in the physical universe, azovi altzvos is dolamata, like anything else in the physical universe. They are the evolutionary outcome of a spiritual process. So there's a spiritual process that represents the sun that eventually translates into a physical sun, and the same with the moon, etc. Over Mela. Dosos der Tag von Mela levana wird bestimmt als Rosh Chodesh. So therefore, why is Rosh Chodesh aligned with the birth of a new moon? Because that means that is the day that the new energy of the Shoresh, the spiritual source of the moon, or the renewal of the moon, this is the day when that spiritual source is activated. Now how do we know? Do you have some kind of a spiritual telescope that you look up in the sky and say, they have now activated the new energy for Chodesh Shvat? Can you see that? You can't. So what do you look for? You look for its physical reflection. Is there now the new moon of Rosh Chodesh Shvat? Therefore, hat uns die Torah angesagt, dass wir sollen gewähr sein, Chodesh leiten Mädel alle Wonne Shalamata, al pi Hoyreia oder al pi Cheshman. So therefore the Torah tells us, HaChodesh hazeh lachem. This is how it's going to work. You as people, you're going to go out at that time of the month when you anticipate the new moon, you're going to look. And when you see the new moon, you're going to go to Beis Din and testify, and if they accept your testimony, we'll say it's Rosh Chodesh. And post the time of the Sanhedrin, we're going to look at the calendar. And the calendar is based on a calculation from Hillel and Nossi, and that's how we're going to know. That's how we here on earth will be able to recognize that it is the time of the renewal of the energy associated with Moed HaLavana in the spiritual realms. Now sometimes it doesn't match up so perfectly. If for whatever reason Beis Din says this day is Rosh Chodesh, and the physical manifestation of the Moed is a day before or a day after, and the Torah hastens lismech aleim, and the Torah tells us you got to listen to the Beis Din. Even if your eyes are telling you a different story, you have to rely on the Beis Din. Is das gufa ahichacha? It's a phenomenal insight. As dafkin dem tog welchen Torah semes is keval Rosh Chodesh is the moiled alavona ha'ikri shelamayla. Torah doesn't make mistakes. If the Torah has devised a system, and within that system, using the Beis Din as vetting the witnesses, or as determining a calendar years in advance, they've said that this is the day of Rosh Chodesh. That is evidence that Torah's emes is giving us to know that in the spiritual realm, that is the time of the Moiled HaLavana, the exposure of the new spiritual energy of that month. Why does it not match how it is physically? The fact that the date on the calendar says Rosh Chodesh and Moiled is another day, that's because something has occurred, which means that the physical world is not properly spiritually aligned, and because of that misalignment, the spiritual energy is not able to flow into the world at the correct time. So the spiritual energy becomes available at a certain time, and it's only picked up on earth at a different time. So the Moiled is here and Rosh Chodesh is there. That's a fascinating insight into how the entire astronomical spiritual process works. That helps us to appreciate that what we're going through here may not be on exactly the same timeline as how it is in the spiritual realms, but Torah will illustrate to us how it is in spirituality. Weil der See, sagen wir jetzt eben der Montedini, was seinem verbunden mit Kufas Achama, Birkas Achama, Bechule. Now let's go back and analyze the different halachas that are associated with the solar system, the solar cycles, the seasons, etc. Die Dienen von Teresema seien bikarim verbunden mit Kufas Achama Shelemaila. When you want to know every 28 years, when is the correct time to say the Birkas Achama, know that we will define that based on spiritual processes, which the Torah will divulge to us. Der Rebbe ist kein Kasche nicht, was bei die didn't wird angenommen der Cheshbon von Kufa Shmuel. So at that point, if we're primarily looking at how things play out spiritually, we get why the opinion we're using to make the calculations is Shmuel's calculations. Because they were looking primarily at the spiritual realm, where things don't necessarily always match up as neatly as we'd like in physical terms. If we're calculating how things have to affect us here physically, we need Rav Ada because he has the neater connections. Wie bald das sagt, dass noch jede 28 Jahre ist der Loche kach v'kach. If the Torah, which is absolute truth, tells us that every 28 years, at this particular time, the halacha is that that's when you credit Hashem for having created the sun, that means that tells us uns ist verbunden mit der Kufa, and that is linked obviously to that spring equinox. Is der von Kufa Muchoch, as in dem Zman is die Kufa Shalamayla. If Torah tells us that's the time, that means that is the time that particular spiritual energy is activated every 28 years. Es ist nur, was die gewissen Sibes kommt darauf die Kufa Dolamatin and das Zman Kufa Savada. But for whatever reason, there is this misalignment between what the Torah is telling us and what our physical experience of life is, which is calculated by Rav Ada's calculation. And perhaps in our physical experience of life, we won't be able to determine physically, with our eyes, with our Hubble telescope, we won't be able to see in the solar patterns what the Torah is telling us is happening in the spiritual patterns. Now, we still are going to have a couple of things to understand about this. We still have to understand a few things. Everything the Torah says, especially things that are practical that you actually do, is a mikra da psak din yotzim de pshutoi. We don't generally say, oh, halacha is non-literal. The timing of a halacha is non-literal. We don't normally do that. The way that you fulfill halacha has to be practical. Yes, of course, every mitzvah has its spiritual source. Yes, but that's not how we work it out. How do you work out what time Shabbos is? Do you work it out based on some kind of a spiritual calculation when the shoresh of Shabbos starts to activate? No, you look on the calendar, you say, what time does the sun set? That's a physical thing you see with your own eyes, and you work backwards 18 minutes before that. That's when we take on Shabbos. And this is not only something relevant to mitzvahs, as dafka durch sekim kipshuten nimmt man euch den yalem aruchnim from mitzvahs, where obviously when it comes to doing a mitzvah, it is the physical activity of doing the mitzvah that helps you to grasp the spiritual potential available within that mitzvah. Take tefillin as an example. You could meditate from here till Mashiach comes about the concept of the 4 levels of intellect that tefillin gives you access to. Means nothing till you put the tefillin on your arm. The meditation gives you 0. The mitzvah chaps everything. But not only when it comes to practical mitzvahs, nor anything quoted in Torah is kanal the fundamental principle of Torah is, as it is said, that's how you're to understand it. So if that's the case, how do you understand the Gemara Brachos, which says that Birchas Hachama is the person who sees the sun at its tkufa, meaning to say, resuming its original position from the time of creation. That means when you see with your own eyes. No? In the same way you see the sun set, now you know that it's Shabbos, you know it's Shkia. So in the same way you see, it says, Horoya, you see it. Why are you telling me all these things about Shmuel, looking at how it is in the spiritual realms, and it doesn't necessarily align with the physical? So how practically here on earth can we say a bracha using Hashem's name, as we do a Birchas Hachama, for something that's happening in the spiritual realms and we cannot actually physically relate to it? If it's not really the time of the tkufa, of the equinox, how do we do that? You'll say, good question. Why don't you ask the same question about Rosh Chodesh not matching the Moilad Alavana? Same thing, right? It's not the same thing. As a Kiddush or Kfis Rosh Chodesh is nicht abhängig in Zman from Moilad Alavana Shelamata. So why is it not the same thing? Because look, you'll say, when it comes to Kiddush HaChodesh, the Torah decides that there's such a thing as Rosh Chodesh, as we'll see in a moment. So, but there's a big difference between how you calculate Rosh Chodesh and how you make a bracha over the equinox every 28 years. Yes, Rosh Chodesh is pegged to the renewal of the moon, the new lunar cycle. Rosh Chodesh is not an astronomical concept. Rosh Chodesh is not a natural phenomenon. Rosh Chodesh is a Torah concept that only Jews experience. Das was es is a Yom Kadosh, the fact that it's a holy day, Karbonos Rosh Chodesh v'chole, a day you bring sacrifices, was based on Mekadosh given, or the Kichur Shamayim, which is sanctified either by the basin or by Shamayim. The Rebbe is leicht to verstehen, so it's a lot easier to understand in that context. Wie der Metzius von Rosh Chodesh is verbunden mit Moilad Shelamayla. It's easy to understand. Okay, so Rosh Chodesh is a spiritual concept, so it must be linked to a spiritual energy force, which sometimes does and sometimes does not align with the physical reality. When the Moilad Shelamata is in an Andusman, and if it's misaligned, no, because it's a spiritual concept, so it still works spiritually, even if the physical astronomy doesn't look that way. But the whole point of Birchas Hachama is that you see the solar equinox. That's not a spiritual Torah concept. The equinox is a natural phenomenon. It has to do with the orbital process of the sun. The whole point of Birchas Hachama is that we're claiming that the sun is now exactly where it was at the moment of its creation, gone full circle again for whatever amount of times. It's not that moving, so it makes no sense. We said a mikra yotzim midei pshuta, and more than that, this is a mitzvah of horoya. You have to see the sun in this particular position, and that's what gives you the rights to say Birchas Hachama. How could it possibly be a mitzvah that is determined based on the spiritual reality that doesn't reflect here on earth? The kasha is noch starker, and the question is particularly potent when you consider the din from Birchas Hachama is roy echama bit kufasa. Go back and look at the words. The words say, when do you say the bracha? When you see the sun in its so-called zenith, in its so-called equinox. And if you don't see the sun, if 28 years you're waiting for this opportunity and it's cloudy, you don't get to say the bracha. Okay, maybe there are some opinions who will argue that you could say the bracha, but the majority opinion is you don't say the bracha. The bracha is verbunden mit Zen, die Gashmis, die Gesund. The bracha of Birchas Hachama is tethered to actually physically seeing the sun. Chotch is nit bit kufasa, regardless of whether it's in exactly the right position or not. So now you're going to tell me, but don't worry, we're making the bracha because spiritually it's all fine. How does that work? It's a physical requirement to see a natural phenomenon and you're not seeing it. How can you say the bracha? That would be like saying you're going to say a bracha over food where there's actually no food. It's a virtual meal. Doesn't make any sense. So to answer that question, we're going to call on one of the most famous debates around the Jewish calendar, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. We'll first explore what's the cheshbon hatkufas, silent kufas shmula, silent kufas Rav Ado, because the real question is, when do you start the calculation? Okay, so we know there's 28 years and 19 years and all these things. Starting from when? When was day dot? So both Rav Ada and Shmuel will tell you Niet von der erste Tkufa von nach Brias Ha'olam. They will both tell you that day dot is not once the world was already created. Now von der Tkufa in Shnas Toyu Ede die Welt ist beschaffen geworden. But it actually starts from the year of Toyu Vavoyu, the so-called organic soup from which the world was going to be, or spiritual soup from which the world was going to be created. This world of an unformed reality that's actually a year earlier. That's when you start the calculations. Now, it's a bizarre concept. The Asbora in dem is, the explanation of that concept is this. Wegen der Prukte zwischen Rabbi Eliezer und Rabbi Yeshua. So here's that famous argument. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, when was the world created? In Tishrei or in Nisan? Is Mavur b'chama mekoymes explained in many places. V'yashgozim azoyin Tosfos, some bring it in the Tosfos in Rosh Hashanah. As beide deos zainen emes, it's true the world was created in Tishrei and the world was created in Nisan. How's that possible? But Nisan is ola b'machshava livroy es ha'olam. Nisan is where the world was created in concept. On the B'ribah Fail is given by Tishrei, and the actual physical creation occurred in Chodesh Tishrei. And seeing as to make the calculations of when the tukufos are, when the seasons begin, we follow Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, which is as ben Nisan nivra ha'olam, that the world was created before it was physically made. That's why the entire basis of the whole calculation of all astronomy as it plays out in Judaism, specifically for our conversation, how you work out the seasons, all begins in the Shnas Toyu, which is effectively 6 months before physical, practical creation. So that has an application now in this big question we have about Brichas HaChama. Is menegei as Brichas HaChama rechnen sich nicht mit der Tkufa shel Mayla af al pi as the Tkufa is in an anderes man. Because the whole concept of Tekufa to begin with is a metaphysical concept. The whole concept of Tekufa begins from a period of time that really technically cannot be measured, yet you're using it as a basis of measuring time. And you're using it as the basis for astronomical bodies that were not, celestial bodies that were not yet created. That tells you that anything associated with Tekufa is actually more about the spiritual than about the physical. And therefore any halacha which has to do with seasons, with a solar process, versus no like Tekufa Shmuel, which we calculate according to Shmuel's calculations, then we bald as Yonah when you say von ganzen Cheshman at Tekufa in the von Tekufas Toihu, von alle b'machshava livroi, seeing as the entire basis of the concept of Tekufa begins in an abstract, ethereal, spiritual space Hashem's thought to create. It doesn't actually matter if the Tekufos don't align with the physical reality, because Tekufos are a non-physical concept to start with. They have to have bearing on the physical reality, but they don't necessarily always have to match the physical reality. Von deswegen is moving, of course, you'll appreciate, there's no question that whatever's going on in the spiritual realms does have a direct impact on the way things are in the physical reality too. That's why we still got to look at the sun. There has to be a link between the physical, our world, and the spiritual concept that's going on. So the Tekufa, the actual time frame, is determined on a spiritual scale. For me as a human to access that time frame and thereby fulfill this mitzvah, I still have to have some kind of physical interaction. How? I have to see the sun. The only thing is that then raises a question in the opposite direction, because now we've really satisfied for Shmuel that even though Shmuel seems to have this additional solar year every 19 years that could potentially create so much problems for us, it actually all makes sense once you know that Tekufos are fundamentally a spiritual concept. But then that raises a question in the other direction. If the whole concept of Tekufos is somewhat abstract and therefore aligned with Shmuel's explanations that don't necessarily fit the physical reality we live, or nit Tekufas Rav Ada, and so therefore the primary consideration is not Rav Ada's calculations that fit so neatly with our human experience, Was sein Cheshbon is not b'shaychus to the kufa shalamata. Rav Ada is fundamentally focused on our human experience. And how then can we say as the fact that the Torah tells us that Pesach must dafka be at the time of spring? Now we've already explained there's only one way that Pesach, not Nisan, Pesach will always be in spring. That's only if you follow Rav Ada's calculations. So now it looks like we've completely ignored how the Tukufos operate in the spiritual realms, and we're only interested in how the Tukufos operate in the physical reality. Why the change? You've explained so beautifully that Tukufa is an abstract concept, and therefore it can satisfy spiritual concepts that don't align with the physical reality. Why then, when it comes to Pesach, do we dafka anchor it to the physical reality? The explanation is this. The Tamadova was the Tkufa Shalamat is an undersman from the Tkufa Shalamaida. We already discussed why would there be a misalignment between how things play out in the spiritual seasons versus how they play out in the physical seasons. Is val olam is kanal damos nit roit so ifnem the Tkufa Shalamaila was is heche from Welten is manim. We already said the only reason that would happen, that there would be this misalignment, would be because somehow the world doesn't deserve it. It's not where it should be. The world is not as refined as it should be. So it's kind of missing the energy that's flowing down from the spiritual realms. When is it possible for that to happen? That's as long as you live in the reality of the physical world. But the moment you talk about Pesach, the idea of Pesach and Pesach being in the spring, Pesach is a Torah dike. Pesach is not part of this world. Pesach is a super concept, a spiritual concept, a Torah concept. Pesach empowers the world to naturally be able to align with its spiritual season at that particular point in time. Das heißt, that means to say that the fact that Pesach always lands up being in the spring is not just because of the calculations and gymnastics of Chazal who managed to get it to always fit. It's because spiritually it will always align with the physical reality. But when you're talking about things that are more physical, like the natural phenomenon called the renewal of the sun, the solar equinox, then sometimes they don't align. It's possible because the world is not always strong enough to accommodate what the spiritual realm has to offer it. Now we can finally understand what the Rambam told us as the fact that we created this 19-year cycle and relied effectively on Shmuel's approach as the Shana Dav Zayin Azayor Vasir Chedesh is Bisman Ha'aviv, which will ensure that Nisan always coincides with spring, even if Pesach will be before the spring. That fits also with Shmuel's opinion. What do you mean? We know practically that we are going to have to use Rav Ada because we need Pesach to be in the spring. That's true. But we don't want to leave Shmuel out altogether. Why? Because Pesach is this absolute harmony of the spiritual and the physical seasons. And because Shmuel's cheshbon is the one that calculates the spiritual seasons, so now when you want to learn about how the years should be defined, which is very much a physical part of our world, so we could do it the astronomical way, the scientific method, and say, let's use Rav Ada's calculations and just see how it plays out in physical realm. We don't do that. We also, says the Rambam, need to align our physical experience of the seasons with Shmuel's cheshbonos, so that we bring the spiritual seasons into the physical seasons. Because if you think about it, ultimately that is exactly what Torah is all about: to bring the higher realm into the lower realm, to bring kedusha into Olam Hazeh, and obviously through that, to be able to harmonize the world to the point that we're ready for the Gilui of Mashiach Tzidkenu, Teikef Umiyad Mamash.